Hello everyone. Welcome back to Dread Report. Tonight we examine 7 documented encounters from the Appalachian region, cases that occurred during sustained rainfall, when visibility dropped and isolation became absolute. These are not folklore. They are testimonies pulled from witness statements, emergency dispatch recordings, and incident reports filed across rural counties in Tennessee, West Virginia, and Kentucky. From the back roads of Greenbrier County to the outskirts of Sevier, a pattern begins to emerge. Travelers stranded by weather, homes without power for days, and something moving just beyond the tree line, where the rain obscures everything but movement itself. The accounts share disturbing similarities, figures that appear only when storms settle in, sounds that mimic human voices calling from the darkness, and encounters that leave no physical evidence behind. Across state lines and isolated townships, these incidents were recorded between 2009 and 2021. Names and exact locations have been altered to protect those involved. The cases remain open. The explanations remain insufficient. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to Dread Report for daily true horror investigations. The rain doesn't wash everything away. Sometimes it brings things to the surface. Now let us begin. I still can't drive that stretch of road after dark. Hell, I can barely tell this story without my hands starting to shake, but I need to get it out. Maybe putting it into words will help me sleep again. Maybe it won't. Either way, what happened to me on that mountain road outside Clay County changed something fundamental in how I see the world. It was late October, around 2019. I'd been visiting my uncle up near Hayesville, helping him winterize his cabin before the first real cold set in. The work took longer than expected, replacing rotted deck boards, sealing windows, checking the roof for damage. By the time we finished, the sun was already sinking behind the ridgeline, painting the sky that particular shade of bruised purple you only see in the mountains. My uncle offered to let me stay the night, but I'd promised my wife I'd be home. It was only a 2-hour drive, and I'd made it dozens of times before. I should have stayed. The first hour went fine. I had the radio on, some classic rock station out of Asheville, and I was making good time on the main highway. But I decided to take the old route through the National Forest, a shortcut I'd discovered years back that shaved about 20 minutes off the drive. The road was narrower, barely 2 lanes in most places, with steep drop-offs on one side and dense forest pressing in on the other. During the day, it was beautiful. At night, especially without much moonlight, it felt like driving through a tunnel of absolute darkness. I was about halfway through when the rain started. It didn't build gradually the way rain usually does in the mountains. One moment the night was clear and still, and the next, it was like someone had opened a floodgate in the sky. The kind of rain that doesn't just fall, it attacks. Within seconds, my windshield was a wall of water, my wipers absolutely useless against the deluge. I slowed to maybe 15 miles an hour, leaning forward until my nose was nearly touching the steering wheel, trying desperately to keep the faint white lines of the road in my vision. The temperature had dropped too. I could see my breath fogging the glass, and the rain was mixed with something heavier, not quite sleet, but close. The sound of it hammering against the roof of my truck was so loud I had to turn off the radio. All I could hear was that relentless drumming and the struggling whine of my wipers as they fought a losing battle. I was considering pulling over, finding a wide spot to wait it out, when my headlights caught something in the road ahead. A person. A woman, standing maybe 30 feet in front of my truck, right in the middle of the road. I hit the brakes harder than I meant to, feeling the truck slide a bit on the wet pavement before the tires caught. My heart was pounding. Jesus, I'd almost hit her. What the hell was she doing out here? She was just standing there, perfectly still, about 10 feet beyond where my headlights really penetrated the rain. I could make out her shape, average height, thin, wearing what looked like a dress or long coat. Her hair was long, dark, hanging down past her shoulders in wet ropes. She wasn't moving, wasn't trying to flag me down or get out of the road, just standing there with her head slightly bowed, like she was looking at the pavement. I sat there for a moment, engine idling, trying to make sense of it. There were no other cars around, no buildings for miles. How had she gotten here? Was she hurt? Confused? Maybe she'd been in an accident and wandered away from her vehicle in shock. I rolled down my window about an inch, just enough to call out. The rain immediately started spitting in, cold and stinging. "Hey!" I shouted over the storm. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't respond, didn't even seem to hear me. Just stood there, swaying slightly. Or maybe that was just the way the rain was hitting her. It was hard to tell. I tried again, louder this time. "Miss, are you hurt?" That's when I heard it. Her voice, or something like a voice, thin and distant, barely audible over the rain. She was saying something, her lips moving, but I couldn't make out the words. It sounded almost like she was whispering, which made no sense because there was no way I should have been able to hear a whisper from that distance in this storm. I leaned closer to the window, straining to hear, and that's when it happened. She was closer, much closer, not walking closer, not stepping forward. Just suddenly there, maybe 5 feet from my truck's front bumper, in the space between one blink and the next. Same posture, same bowed head, same swaying motion, but 5 feet closer than she'd been a second ago. My blood went cold. That primal animal part of my brain started screaming that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. I could see her more clearly now in the headlights. Her dress or coat was pale, gray or white, soaked through and clinging to her thin frame. Her hair was plastered across her face, completely obscuring it. Water was streaming off her, but she wasn't shivering, wasn't reacting to the cold at all. And she was still whispering. I could hear it now, even through the closed window, even over the rain. Not words exactly, but the cadence of words, repeating the same pattern over and over. Every instinct I had was telling me to get out of there. I slammed the truck into reverse, my hands shaking so badly I almost couldn't grip the wheel. I started backing up, slowly at first, trying to keep the truck on the narrow road. She moved forward again, not walked, not ran, just moved, like a frame had been cut out of film. 1 second she was by my bumper, the next she was right at my driver's side window, her face, her hidden face, level with mine, separated only by a 1/4 inch of glass. I could see the water running down the window between us, could see the individual strands of her hair pressed against the glass, could see her lips moving behind that curtain of wet hair, still forming those same whispered words I couldn't understand. Her breath was fogging the glass from the outside. I lost it. I jerked the wheel, swung the truck around in a sloppy 3-point turn that nearly sent me over the edge into the trees, and floored it. The tires spun on the wet road for a horrible second before catching, and then I was accelerating down the mountain, taking curves way too fast, my truck fishtailing on the slick pavement. I drove for maybe 2 minutes like that, both hands white-knuckled on the wheel, checking my mirrors every few seconds to make sure she wasn't somehow behind me. The road was empty, just rain and darkness. I started to breathe a little easier, started to tell myself I'd just panicked, let my imagination run away with me. She'd probably just been closer than I'd realized, and the rain and shadows had played tricks on my perception. Maybe she'd stepped forward while I was blinking. Maybe something dripped on the back of my neck. Cold. Impossibly cold. Like ice water running down my spine and spreading across my shoulders. I froze. Completely froze. My hands still on the wheel, my foot easing off the accelerator, my eyes locked straight ahead on the rain-swept road. I didn't want to look. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me not to look in the rearview mirror. But I did. The back seat was empty, just my uncle's old toolbox and a rolled-up tarp, both slightly wet from where I'd tossed them in earlier. Normal. Everything was normal. Except for the water. There was water all over the seat, pooling in the creases of the leather, dripping down onto the floor mats. Enough water for a person to have been sitting there, soaking wet for several minutes. Another drip hit my neck. I jerked, looked up at the roof of the cabin. The dome light was off, everything in shadow. But I could see water. I could swear I could see water. Gathering on the ceiling above me, beating up and dripping down. And then I heard it. That whisper, right behind my ear, so close I could feel the breath, if it was breath, tickling the hairs on my neck. This time I understood the words. You came back. Not come back. Not a plea or a request, a statement. You came back. Like she'd been waiting, like she knew I would. I don't remember much of what happened next. I know I screamed. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I know I jerked the wheel hard to the right and somehow managed not to crash. I know the truck went partially off the road, 2 wheels churning in the mud and gravel of the shoulder before I got control back. I know I kept driving, going way too fast for the conditions, not daring to look at the mirror, not daring to acknowledge the presence I could feel in the back seat. The whisper continued the whole time. You came back. You came back. You came back. Over and over, in that thin, distant voice that seemed to come from somewhere far away and right next to me at the same time. I finally hit the main highway about 15 minutes later. Streetlights, other cars, civilization. The moment I merged onto that well-lit road, the whispering stopped. Just cut off mid-word, like someone had flipped a switch. I pulled into the first gas station I found and sat there in the parking lot under the fluorescent lights, shaking, for almost an hour. I finally worked up the courage to look in the back seat. It was completely dry. The toolbox, the tarp, the seats, everything was dry as bone, like the water had never been there at all. But my neck was wet. My shirt collar was soaked through. And when I looked in the rearview mirror, I could see the tracks where water had run down from my hairline, following the curve of my spine. I drove the rest of the way home on the highway, taking the long route, adding 40 minutes to my trip. I didn't care. When I got home, I told my wife I'd gotten caught in the rain, which was true enough. I didn't tell her about the woman. I didn't tell anyone. For about a month. Then the dream started. I'd be back on that road, in the rain, and I'd see her again. Sometimes she'd be standing in the road like before. Sometimes she'd already be in the back seat when I got in the truck. But always, she'd whisper those same words. You came back. The worst part. About 3 weeks after it happened, I was telling my uncle about taking the mountain route, and he got this odd look on his face. He asked me exactly which road I'd taken, and when I told him, he went quiet for a long moment. You know, a woman died on that stretch about 5 years back, he finally said. Car accident in the rain. Went off the road and wasn't found for 3 days. They say she probably survived the crash, but died of exposure, waiting for help that never came. He paused, looking uncomfortable. Her husband said she'd been acting strange that whole week before the accident. Kept saying someone was going to come back for her, that she'd been waiting, and they were finally coming back. I haven't taken that road since. I drive an extra hour now when I visit my uncle, staying on the highway the whole way. But on rainy nights, especially in October, I sometimes wake up at 3 a.m. with water dripping on the back of my neck, and in the darkness of my bedroom, I can hear that whisper, faint but unmistakable. You came back. I don't know what she thinks I came back for. I don't know why she chose me. And I sure as hell don't know why she's still with me, even now, all these miles and months away from that mountain road. But I know she's waiting for something, and I'm terrified that one day I'm going to find out what. I'd been working a desk job in Charlotte for 7 years when I finally admitted to myself that I was coming apart at the seams. The fluorescent lights, the meetings about meetings, the slow suffocation of it all. It had wormed its way so deep into my chest that I couldn't take a full breath anymore. My doctor suggested therapy. My sister suggested yoga. I suggested a week alone in the mountains, and that's how I ended up searching for cabin rentals in the Black Balsam area. The listing I found was perfect in its simplicity. 1 bedroom, wood-burning stove, no Wi-Fi, no television. The photos showed a modest A-frame tucked against a wall of old-growth hemlocks, the kind of place that looked like it had stood there since before the hiking trails had names. The owner, an older man named Dale, met me at a gas station off the Blue Ridge Parkway to hand over the keys. He looked me over with the particular skepticism mountain people reserve for city folk. "You been up there before?" he asked. "No, sir. First time in this area." He nodded slowly, working something around in his jaw. "Reception's gonna be spotty, real spotty. You got everything you need? Food, firewood, first aid?" I assured him I did. He seemed like he wanted to say something else, but instead he just tapped the roof of my car twice and told me to drive safe. The road up was worse than I expected, rutted dirt that wound through dense forest, climbing higher until my ears popped. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was already sinking behind the ridgeline, painting everything in shades of copper and shadow. The place was exactly as advertised. Small, clean, isolated. I could hear nothing but wind moving through the trees and the occasional cry of something distant, a hawk, maybe, or a raven. I unpacked quickly, started a fire in the stove, and made myself a simple dinner of canned soup and crackers. As darkness settled around the cabin like a heavy blanket, I felt something in my chest begin to loosen. This was what I needed. Silence. Space. Time to think, or not think at all. The rain started around 9 o'clock. I'd been reading by lamplight, some paperback thriller I'd picked up at an airport months ago and never finished. The first drops were gentle, almost apologetic, tapping against the metal roof with a soft, irregular rhythm. Within 20 minutes, it had built into a proper mountain storm, the kind that sounds like the sky is emptying itself all at once. The roof trembled under the weight of it. Water rushed through the gutters with a sound like a river cutting through stone. I set down my book and listened. There's something primal about being in a small structure during a storm, something that makes you aware of how thin the walls are, how fragile the boundary between inside and outside. The wind picked up, shoving against the cabin's frame. And somewhere in the distance, I heard the crack of a branch giving way. I added another log to the fire and told myself I was grateful for the roof over my head. That's when I first heard the humming. It was so faint at first that I thought I was imagining it. Just a low, wavering tone that seemed to drift down from somewhere above me. I stood still, holding my breath, trying to separate it from the rain. The sound persisted. A woman's voice, I was almost certain, carrying a melody that rose and fell like something half-remembered from childhood. I looked up at the ceiling, at the exposed beams running the length of the cabin, and tried to convince myself it was the wind. Mountain air can do strange things when it pushes through gaps in a building. It can moan, whistle, even sound like speech if you're tired enough. But this wasn't wind. This was a voice. I walked to the kitchen and turned off the lamp, plunging the cabin into the orange glow of the fire. The humming continued, clearer now without the distraction of light. It seemed to be moving, drifting from one end of the roof to the other, following the slope of the beams. The melody was slow, mournful, one of those old mountain ballads that sound like they've been passed down so many times they've worn smooth. I recognized the shape of it, though I couldn't place where I'd heard it before. My rational mind offered explanations. A neighbor, maybe, though Dale had said the nearest cabin was 3 miles down the mountain. An animal, though no animal I knew could sustain a tune like that. A trick of the storm, though the sound was too deliberate, too human. I stood in the center of the living room and listened as the voice traced a path across the roof, back and forth, like someone pacing. By 11 o'clock, I'd managed to half convince myself I was overreacting. I poured myself a whiskey from the flask I'd packed, drank it too fast, and tried to focus on my book again. The humming had faded into the background noise of the storm, or maybe I'd just gotten used to it. Either way, I told myself it didn't matter. I was here to disconnect, to let my mind rest. Obsessing over strange sounds in an old cabin wasn't going to help. Around midnight, the humming stopped. The silence that followed was so complete, it felt like a physical thing pressing down on me. Even the rain seemed to soften, falling in a gentler rhythm that let me hear the pop and hiss of the fire. I exhaled slowly, feeling tension drain from my shoulders. Whatever I'd been hearing was gone. I could go to bed now, sleep through the rest of the storm, wake up to morning light, and laugh at how spooked I'd gotten. Then the footsteps began. They started near what I guessed was the front corner of the roof, directly above the porch. Slow, shuffling steps, the sound of bare feet on wet metal. Each footfall was distinct, deliberate, moving with the pace of someone in no hurry at all. I felt my entire body go rigid. The book slipped from my hands and hit the floor with a slap that made me flinch. The steps moved along the ridgeline, traveling from front to back, pausing occasionally as if the walker was stopping to look down at something. My eyes tracked the sound across the ceiling. Whoever was up there was taking their time, exploring the roof like they were searching for something, or like they were waiting for me to react. I should have stayed inside. Every instinct I had that was worth trusting told me to lock the door, keep the fire going, wait for morning. But fear does strange things to a person's judgment. The thought of something walking on the roof above me, pacing back and forth while I cowered below, filled me with a panic that bordered on rage. I needed to see. I needed to know. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and moved to the door, my hand shaking as I gripped the handle. The footsteps had stopped again, this time directly above the center of the cabin, directly above where I was standing. I could hear the faint creak of the metal roof bending slightly under weight. Then the humming returned. It was so close now it might have been inside the cabin with me. The same slow melody, but this time the voice was whispering the tune rather than humming it. A woman's voice, soft and strangely intimate, forming words I couldn't quite make out. The sound seemed to seep through the ceiling, drifting down through the cracks between beams. My skin crawled. I yanked the door open and stumbled out onto the porch. The rain hit me immediately, cold and sharp. I swept the flashlight beam across the roof, illuminating sheets of water running down the metal. Nothing. No person, no animal, nothing at all. The roof was empty, slick, and undisturbed. I moved off the porch and circled the cabin, my shoes sinking into mud, the flashlight shaking in my grip. I checked every angle, every shadow. There were no footprints in the mud around the foundation. No ladder, no tree branches close enough to reach the roof. No sign that anyone had been there at all. But the humming didn't stop. It drifted away from the cabin now, floating out into the darkness beyond the reach of my flashlight. I turned toward the sound and saw nothing but the black wall of the forest, rain falling through the beam of light like static. The voice was coming from the trees, from somewhere deep in that lightless space between the hemlocks. It was calling to me. Not with words exactly, but with the shape of the melody itself, each note bending toward me like a finger beckoning. Come closer, it seemed to say. Come listen. I don't know how long I stood there in the rain, shining my flashlight into the woods and hearing that voice drift just beyond its reach. It felt like the forest itself was singing, like the darkness had found a throat and was using it to draw me in. Part of me wanted to follow it. That's the worst part to admit, that some small, irrational piece of my brain wanted to walk into those trees and find the source of the sound, to know what it was, to understand. Instead, I backed toward the cabin, my eyes locked on the tree line, waiting for something to emerge. The humming continued, growing neither louder nor softer, simply hanging in the air like a thread I could almost see. When my heel hit the porch steps, I turned and ran inside, slamming the door behind me and throwing the deadbolt. I stood with my back against the wood, breathing hard, rain dripping from my hair and soaking into the floorboards. The humming was still there, quieter now, muffled by the walls, but present, always present. I moved to the window and pressed my face against the glass, trying to see anything in the darkness outside. The rain blurred everything. For a moment I thought I saw movement near the trees, a pale shape, tall and thin, standing just at the edge of where the porch light reached. But when I blinked, it was gone, and I couldn't be sure it had ever been there at all. I spent the rest of the night sitting in a chair by the fire, the flashlight in my lap and my phone in my hand, even though it had no signal. The humming faded sometime before dawn, disappearing so gradually I didn't notice it was gone until the silence returned. When the first gray light began to seep through the windows, I finally allowed myself to close my eyes. I woke to full morning sun streaming through the glass. The storm had passed completely, leaving the world outside scrubbed clean and bright. I walked out onto the porch and looked up at the roof. It was dry, unmarked, exactly as it should be. The forest beyond was green and ordinary, birds moving through the branches, a chipmunk darting across a fallen log. There was no trace of anything unusual, no evidence that the night before had been anything more than exhaustion and an overactive imagination. I should have left then, packed my things, driven back down the mountain, and never thought about the cabin again. But something kept me there. Maybe it was pride or stubbornness, or the fact that I'd paid for a full week and didn't want to waste the money. I told myself it had been the storm, the isolation, the darkness playing tricks on me. Nothing more. That second night was worse. The rain returned just after sunset, and with it came the humming. This time it started earlier, before full dark, and it was louder, more insistent. The footsteps on the roof began almost immediately, pacing back and forth with a rhythm that felt purposeful. I stayed inside, doors locked, fire burning, trying to ignore the sound. But ignoring it was impossible. The voice was seeping into my thoughts, the melody worming its way so deep into my head that I caught myself humming along without meaning to. Around midnight, I heard something new. A scratching sound, like fingernails on metal, moving along the edge of the roof near the chimney. Then a soft thump, as if something had dropped onto the porch. I sat frozen in my chair, staring at the door, watching the handle. It didn't move, but I could hear breathing on the other side, slow, wet breathing that rattled slightly with each exhale. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. By the fourth night, I was seeing things in the corners of the cabin, shadows that moved wrong, shapes that shouldn't have been there. The humming never stopped anymore. It followed me from room to room, drifting through the walls like smoke. When I finally broke and tried to drive down the mountain, my car wouldn't start. The battery was dead, though it had been fine that morning. I called Dale from the gas station payphone after I hiked out on the fifth day. I was exhausted, filthy, barely coherent. I told him something was wrong with the cabin. He was quiet for a long time. "You heard her, didn't you?" he finally said. I didn't answer, didn't need to. "It's been happening for years," he continued. "Folks rent the place. Most of them make it a night or two before they leave. Some people don't hear nothing at all, but the ones who do..." He trailed off. "They always hear her singing, looking for something she lost up there a long time ago, looking for someone to help her find it." I asked him what she lost. He said he didn't know, said nobody knew, said it didn't matter because she was never going to find it anyway. I never went back for my things. Dale had them shipped to me weeks later, my clothes, my books, everything I'd left behind. But sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I still hear it. That faint humming, drifting through the ceiling like it's looking for me, like it followed me home. And I know that if I listen too long, if I let myself follow that melody back to where it wants to take me, I'll end up walking into the woods behind my house and never coming back. So I don't listen. I turn on music, or the television, or I go outside where there are streetlights and people and noise. Anything to drown out that voice. Because I know now what it wants. It wants me to come closer. It wants me to listen. And God help me, some nights I almost do. I'd been driving through these mountains my whole life, 37 years of knowing every hairpin turn and washed-out shoulder from here to the Tennessee line. My daddy drove these roads, and his daddy before him. So when people at the gas station in Cripple Creek started whispering about Old Birch Road again, I didn't pay it much mind. Every generation's got their ghost stories. Their warnings about what happens after dark on forgotten stretches of asphalt that wind through hollows where the sun don't quite reach even at noon. But that night in October, with the storm rolling in fast and mean off the ridge, I had a choice to make. I could take the long way home, add another hour through well-lit county roads, or I could cut through Old Birch like I'd done 100 times before. The sky was already bruising purple-black, and I could smell that particular wetness in the air that meant the bottom was about to fall out. My daughter's birthday was the next morning, and I'd promised her I'd be there when she woke up. I'd already missed too many mornings because of work, driving rigs cross-country to keep the lights on. So I turned onto Old Birch Road just as the first fat drops started hitting my windshield. The road hadn't been maintained in years, maybe decades. The county had given up on it after the sawmill closed in the 80s, and now it was just a vein of cracked asphalt threading through dense forest, barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass. The trees grew close on both sides, their branches forming a tunnel overhead that turned the twilight into something darker, heavier. Oaks and maples mostly, but the birch trees the road was named for still stood here and there, their white bark glowing like bones in my headlights. The rain came harder. Within minutes it was a downpour, the kind where your wipers can't keep up no matter how fast you run them. I slowed to a crawl, leaning forward over the steering wheel, trying to follow the faded yellow line down the center of the road. The wind picked up, and I could hear branches scraping against the sides of my truck, a sound like fingernails on metal that set my teeth on edge. That's when I saw the light. At first, I thought it was another vehicle, maybe someone else fool enough to be out here in this weather. But it wasn't headlights. It was smaller, warmer, the soft orange glow of an old-fashioned lantern, the kind that burns kerosene. It was just hanging there in the middle of the road, maybe 50 yards ahead, swaying gently despite the wind that was now howling through the trees, hard enough to rock my truck on its suspension. I eased off the gas, my heart already doing something funny in my chest, though I couldn't have told you why. The rational part of my brain was busy making excuses. Someone's car broke down. A hiker got caught in the storm. Maybe one of the old-timers who still lived back in these hollers was out checking his property. But there was another part of me, the part that still remembered being 7 years old and hearing my grandmother's stories about these mountains, that was screaming at me to turn around. I didn't turn around. I rolled forward slow, squinting through the rain. The lantern swung in a lazy arc, back and forth, back and forth. But as I got closer, I realized something wasn't right about the movement. It wasn't swinging like something hanging from a hand would swing. It was drifting, floating almost, moving sideways across the road in a way that didn't match the wind or any kind of natural motion, like it was being carried by something I couldn't see, something that moved smooth and deliberate through the storm. I brought the truck to a stop about 20 feet from the light, put it in park. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, though I told myself it was just the cold seeping through the vents. The rain was hammering the roof now, so loud I could barely hear myself think. I reached for the door handle, some stupid instinct to help whoever was out there, but my hand froze halfway there. That's when I heard the voice. It cut through the rain, through the wind, through everything. Not loud, but clear. Too clear. A man's voice, or something like a man's voice, though it had a quality to it that made my skin crawl, hollow, echoing, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "Do you need guidance?" The words hung in the air between us, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. My headlights were still on, cutting through the downpour, and I could see the lantern more clearly now. It was old, the glass panels fogged with age, the metal frame rusted in places. The flame inside burned steady, despite the wind that should have extinguished it a dozen times over. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. I cleared my throat, tried again. "You all right out there?" The lantern drifted to the left, moving off the road toward the tree line. For just a second, my headlights flickered, just a quick stutter, and in that brief darkness, I saw him. He was tall, impossibly tall, maybe 7 feet, though it was hard to judge with the rain and my eyes trying to make sense of what they were seeing. He stood just behind the lantern, one arm extended as if holding it, though there was nothing in his hand that I could see. His clothes were old-fashioned, dark and heavy, the kind of coat my great-grandfather might have worn. But it was his face that made everything inside me go cold and still. He didn't have one. Not really. Where his features should have been, there was just shadow, a hollowness that seemed to drink in the light rather than reflect it. And his feet, Christ, his feet weren't touching the ground. He was hovering maybe 3 or 4 inches above the washed-out gravel shoulder, motionless except for a slight sway, like kelp moving in deep water. The headlights steadied, and he was gone. Just the lantern remained, drifting back toward the center of the road. "Do you need guidance?" The voice came again, and this time I could tell it wasn't coming from outside the truck. It was inside, right behind my left ear, close enough that I should have felt breath on my neck, but there was only cold, a bone-deep cold that made my muscles lock up. I slammed the truck into drive and punched the gas. The tires spun for a second on the wet asphalt before catching, and I lurched forward, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might crack a rib. I didn't look back, couldn't look back. I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead, on the tunnel of light carved by my headlights through the rain and darkness. But the lantern kept pace. It drifted alongside my window, maybe 3 feet away, matching my speed exactly. I was doing 30, 35 miles an hour on that terrible road, hydroplaning through puddles that could have been an inch deep or a foot, and that goddamn lantern floated there like it was tied to my door handle by an invisible string. The flame inside burned brighter now, so bright it hurt to look at, casting sharp shadows across the inside of my cab that jerked and danced in ways shadows shouldn't move. I pressed the accelerator harder, pushing 40, 45. The truck shuddered, the steering wheel fighting me as I hit washouts and potholes that sent jolts up through my spine. The wipers couldn't keep up. The world outside was just water and darkness, and that terrible orange light pacing me, never falling behind, never pulling ahead. And then I saw him again. He was right outside my window, keeping pace, his hollow face slowly turning toward me. The rain fell through him like he wasn't there, like he was made of smoke or mist or something less substantial than air. But the cold radiating off him was real enough. It seeped through the glass, through the metal of the door, turning my breath to fog. Frost began forming on the inside of my window, spreading in delicate fern patterns that reminded me of something, though I couldn't place what. His head finished turning until he was looking straight at me, and even though he had no eyes, I could feel his gaze like physical weight, like fingers pressing against my temples. My vision started to blur at the edges. The road ahead seemed to stretch and narrow, the trees pressing in closer, their branches reaching down like they wanted to pull me up and away from this world entirely. "You need guidance." Not a question this time, a statement, a fact. His voice filled the cab, seemed to come from everywhere at once. The speakers, the vents, the upholstery, my own chest vibrating with words that weren't mine. "Get away from me," I screamed it, primal and raw, and cranked the wheel hard to the right, trying to put distance between us. The truck skidded, the back end sliding out, and for a horrible second I thought I was going to flip, going to roll down into the hollow, and they'd find me in a week, or a month, or never, just another cautionary tale about taking Old Birch Road after dark. But the tires caught, and I straightened out, and suddenly the lantern was gone. Just like that. No fading, no drifting away. 1 second it was there, burning bright enough to wash out everything else, and the next there was only darkness and rain and the weak glow of my own headlights. I kept driving, kept my foot pressed hard on the accelerator, my whole body shaking now, tears running down my face, though I couldn't have told you when I started crying. The rain began to let up. Not gradually, but all at once. Like someone had turned off a faucet. Within seconds it had stopped completely, and I realized I was through the worst of the storm, past the heaviest tree cover. The road ahead was clearer, wider, beginning to look familiar again. I was almost to the county line, almost to the intersection that would take me back to roads with streetlights and gas stations and other people, normal people who didn't drift through storms holding impossible lights. But something was wrong. The road was dry. Completely dry. Not a puddle, not a wet patch, not even dampness on the asphalt. It looked like it hadn't rained here in weeks. I could see stars beginning to show through breaks in the clouds overhead, and the air coming through my vents had that crisp, cool quality of a clear autumn night. I started to laugh, a high, hysterical sound that scared me worse than anything else that had happened. This was impossible. I'd just driven through a downpour that had threatened to wash out the road entirely. My windshield should have been covered in water, my wipers still going. But everything was dry and quiet and wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. That's when I felt the cold air on the back of my neck. I froze, my hands locked on the steering wheel, every muscle in my body going rigid. There was someone in the back seat. I could feel them there, could hear the slight rustle of wet cloth and the soft drip, drip, drip of water hitting the floor mats. The smell hit me next. Rain and old earth and something underneath it, something like turned soil in a graveyard. My eyes flicked up to the rearview mirror. I could see the back seat, see the dark shape of someone sitting directly behind me. But the angle was wrong, and the shadows were too thick, and I couldn't make out any details except for the fact that they were there, and they were very, very still. Slowly, so slowly I barely seemed to be moving at all, I turned my head to look at the passenger seat. The lantern sat upright on the floorboard in front of the seat, its metal base leaving a spreading pool of water on the mat. The flame inside had gone out, but smoke still rose from the wick in a thin, steady column. And resting on the seat itself, arranged carefully like someone had placed it there for me to find, was something that made my heart stop. It was a photograph. Old, the edges curled and yellowed with age. I didn't want to look at it. God help me, I didn't want to know. But I couldn't stop myself from reaching out, from picking it up with shaking fingers and holding it in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. It showed a stretch of road. This road, Old Birch Road, in what might have been the 40s or 50s, judging by the car partially visible at the edge of the frame. And standing in the middle of that road, clear as day, was the tall figure in the dark coat. His face was still shadow, still hollow, but he was holding the lantern up high like a beacon. And surrounding him, barely visible in the darkness beyond the camera's flash, were other shapes. Dozens of them. All tall, all thin, all hovering just above the ground. Written on the back in faded ink were 4 words. He guides them home. I dropped the photograph like it had burned me and slammed on the brakes, sending the lantern rolling forward with a hollow clang. I threw the truck into park right there in the middle of the road and turned around to face the back seat, ready to confront whatever was sitting behind me, ready to fight or flee, or do whatever I needed to do to get out of this with my sanity intact. The back seat was empty. Soaked, the upholstery dark with water, puddles forming in the footwell. But empty. No figure, no presence, nothing but the lingering smell of rain and earth and that other thing, that graveyard thing, that seemed to coat the inside of my throat and lungs. I got out of that truck and ran, just left it idling there in the middle of the road, and ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out and I collapsed on the shoulder near the county line sign. A state trooper found me 20 minutes later, took me back to my truck while I babbled about storms and lanterns and figures that shouldn't exist. He was kind, told me I'd probably just gotten spooked in the weather, that these old roads played tricks on people. But he saw the photograph. I know he did, because his face went pale when he picked it up off the passenger seat, and he asked me very quietly where I'd gotten it. When I told him I didn't know, that it had just appeared, he nodded slowly and slipped it into his pocket. Said he'd run it through some databases, see what he could find out. I never heard from him again, though I called the station 3 times. They said they had no record of anyone picking me up that night, no trooper working that section of road. I made it home by sunrise, just in time to see my daughter's face light up when she came running into the kitchen for her birthday breakfast. I held her tight, maybe too tight, and tried to pretend everything was normal. But sometimes late at night, when the rain starts to fall and the wind picks up, I see that orange glow in my peripheral vision. And I wonder about the photograph, about those shapes surrounding the figure in the old picture. I wonder who they were, where they came from, where they were going. Most of all, I wonder if they wanted guidance, or if guidance found them whether they wanted it or not. I don't drive Old Birch Road anymore. Haven't since that night. Won't ever again. Sometimes I think about warning others, about standing at the turnoff and flagging people down, telling them to take the long way. But who would believe me? Who would listen to a middle-aged trucker with a story about floating lanterns and figures that drift through storms? The locals always said the road was cursed. Now I know they were wrong. It's not cursed. It's a crossing point. A thin place where something old and patient waits in the darkness between the trees, holding up its light, asking the same question it's probably been asking for 100 years or more. Do you need guidance? And God help you if you're fool enough to answer. I've always had a strange relationship with storms. Most folks hunker down when the sky turns that heavy shade of gray and the wind starts rattling the shutters. But not me. There's something about the way the rain changes the mountains, makes them quieter somehow, more honest. Like the forest is finally telling you the truth instead of the pretty lies it shows you in the daylight. My granddaddy used to say storms washed away the veil between things, between what is and what was. I never understood what he meant until that night by the old Henderson Bridge. I'd been walking that trail for near about 3 years at that point. Started doing it after my divorce, when the silence in the house got too loud and the walls felt like they were closing in. Something about being out there in the dark, in the rain, made my problems feel smaller. The mountains don't care about your custody arrangements or who gets the furniture. They just stand there, ancient and indifferent, and there's a comfort in that. So I'd wait for the storms, lace up my boots, grab my flashlight, and head out into the wet darkness like some kind of fool. The Henderson Bridge Trail isn't much to speak of, just an old logging road that winds down to a creek bed where there's this wooden bridge that's been there since before my daddy was born. The bridge is narrow, barely wide enough for a truck, and the wood groans something awful when you cross it. Most people avoid it these days since they built the new county road, but I liked it precisely because nobody went there anymore. During a storm, with the creek swelling and the rain hammering on the canopy above, it felt like the only place in the world. That particular night in late October, the storm had been building all day. By evening, the rain was coming down in sheets, and I could hear the thunder rolling through the valleys like God himself was rearranging furniture up there. I should have stayed home. Even I knew that. But something pulled me out there anyway, some restlessness I couldn't shake, like an itch between my shoulder blades I couldn't quite reach. The walk down was rougher than usual. The trail had turned to mud, and the creek was already high by the time I got close enough to hear it. I could see the bridge up ahead, its dark outline just visible in the beam of my flashlight. The rain had that particular quality it gets in the mountains, not falling straight down, but coming at you sideways, like it's got somewhere to be, and you're just in the way. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks, doing that thing where it sounds almost human as it moves through the hollows. But then I heard it again, clearer this time, someone crying. A woman's voice, muffled and broken. Like someone trying not to be heard, but unable to help themselves. It was coming from underneath the bridge. I stopped in the middle of the trail, rain streaming down my face, listening. The sound was unmistakable now. Soft sobbing, the kind that comes from deep in the chest, the kind that means something's gone terribly wrong. My first thought was that someone had gotten caught out in the storm, maybe slipped down the embankment looking for shelter. It wouldn't be the first time someone got themselves hurt out here. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely carrying over the rain. "You all right down there?" The crying continued, and I could hear it more clearly now. Definitely a woman, and she sounded close. I made my way to the edge of the bridge, shining my light down into the darkness below. The creek was swollen, maybe 3 feet higher than normal, churning brown and angry with runoff. The space beneath the bridge was mostly shadow, just wooden support beams and the rocky bank where the water hadn't yet reached. "I'm coming down," I shouted. "Just hold on." The embankment was slick with mud and dead leaves, and I half slid, half climbed my way down, grabbing onto saplings and roots to keep from tumbling straight into the creek. My flashlight beam bounced wildly, making shadows jump and twist. When I finally got my footing on the rocky bank beneath the bridge, I was breathing hard and covered in mud up to my elbows. "Where are you?" I called out, sweeping the light across the underside of the bridge. "Talk to me so I can find you." The crying stopped. Just like that, mid-sob, it cut off clean as a knife. The sudden silence was worse than the crying had been. Even the rain seemed to soften, like the whole forest had taken a breath and forgotten to let it out. I stood there in that strange quiet, water dripping from the bridge beams above me, my flashlight showing nothing but wood and stone and the dark rushing water. "Miss?" My voice sounded small down there, swallowed up by the space. "You hurt?" That's when I heard the whisper. It was so soft I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, but I know what I heard. It said my name, not shouted, not called out, whispered, like someone standing right next to my ear in the dark. Like whoever said it knew me well enough to use the voice you'd use with a friend or a lover. Every hair on my body stood up. I'd never told anyone I walked this trail, never mentioned it to a soul. Not my ex-wife, not my buddies at work, not even my sister who worried about me living alone. This was my thing, my private ritual, and the only people who knew about these walks were me and the mountains themselves. My hand was shaking as I moved the flashlight beam slowly across the space under the bridge. The light flickered, just once, but enough to make my heart skip. And in that brief moment of dimness, I saw something. A pale shape crouched against one of the support beams, maybe 15 feet away. It was low to the ground, hunched over itself, and in the split second before my light steadied again, I could have sworn I saw it looking at me. When the beam strengthened, there was nothing there. Just the beam, just the shadows, just the sound of water dripping onto stone with a hollow rhythmic echo. I should have left right then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get back up that embankment and go home. But I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to those rocks, and my light kept sweeping back and forth across that empty space, looking for something that I knew had been there a moment before. "Who are you?" I asked, and my voice cracked on the last word. No answer. Just the dripping water, slower now, like even the rain was waiting to see what would happen next. I started backing toward the embankment, keeping my light pointed under the bridge, not willing to turn my back on that darkness. My boot slipped on a wet rock, and I nearly went down, catching myself with my free hand on the muddy slope. That's when the crying started again. But this time, it wasn't coming from under the bridge. It was behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly dropped the flashlight, the beam cutting wild arcs through the rain. There was nothing there, just the creek, swollen and angry, rushing past in the darkness. The far bank was maybe 20 feet away, covered in the same kind of undergrowth and saplings that choked every inch of these mountains. But the crying was coming from somewhere over there, from the trees, that same broken sobbing that had first drawn me down here. I scrambled up the embankment like the devil himself was after me, not caring about the mud or the rain or the branches that slapped at my face. When I got back to the trail, I was breathing so hard I thought my chest might burst. I stood there on the bridge, shining my light down at the space I'd just climbed out of, and I could still hear it. That crying, moving now, shifting from one side of the creek to the other, like something was pacing back and forth down there. Then it whispered my name again, and this time I did run. I ran like I hadn't run since I was a kid, my boots pounding on that old wooden bridge, the sound echoing off the creek below. The crying followed me. I could hear it moving through the trees on either side of the trail, keeping pace with me, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, always just out of sight. And between the sobs I'd hear my name, whispered soft and sad, like someone was mourning me. The trail back seemed 3 times as long as the walk down had been. Every shadow looked like a crouched figure, every tree like someone standing just off the path. The rain came harder now, and my flashlight beam barely cut through it. I kept running, my lungs burning, my legs screaming, until I finally burst out of the tree line and onto the gravel road where I'd parked my truck. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so bad I dropped them twice before I got the door open. When I finally got inside and slammed the door shut, I sat there gasping, my breath fogging up the windows, rain hammering on the roof. I couldn't hear the crying anymore over the storm, but I could still feel it, like something was watching me from the trees, patient and sad, and not quite human. I drove home too fast on those wet roads, white-knuckling the steering wheel, checking my mirrors every few seconds, like something might be following. When I got to my house, I ran from the truck to the front door, and I swear I heard it one more time as I got my key in the lock, that soft crying coming from somewhere in the darkness of my own front yard. I locked every door and window in that house, turned on every light, sat in my living room with my granddaddy's old hunting rifle across my lap, until the sun came up. The storm had passed by then, leaving everything clean and quiet and normal. But I knew what I'd heard. I knew what had whispered my name in the darkness under that bridge. I never walked that trail again. Sold the house 6 months later and moved 2 counties over, told people I got a better job, which was true enough. But the real reason was I couldn't stand living that close to those woods anymore. Couldn't stand the thought that something down there knew my name, had been waiting for me under that old bridge. Sometimes, even now, when it storms and the rain gets that particular sound to it, I'll hear crying. Just faint, like it's coming from far away, from another county or another life. And sometimes when it's real quiet and the wind moves through whatever trees are nearby, I'll hear my name whispered soft and sad, like someone's still looking for me, still waiting by that bridge for me to come back down. My new place is in town now, where the streetlights keep the shadows honest and neighbors are close enough to hear you if you call out. I don't walk in storms anymore. Don't walk much at all after dark, if I'm being honest. Because I learned something that night that I can't unlearn. The mountains do tell the truth during storms, just like my granddaddy said. But some truths aren't meant for us to hear. Some truths are waiting in the dark places, under old bridges and between the trees, calling your name in voices that sound almost human, almost familiar. Almost like someone who loved you once and wants you to come home. And the worst part, the thing that keeps me up some nights even now, I think it's still waiting there. I inherited my aunt's place up in the hills when she passed that winter. Didn't want it, really. But family property stays in the family, and nobody else was willing to make the drive up there to deal with it. The house sat at the end of a gravel road that turned to mud every time it rained, tucked back in the trees where cell service was more myth than reality. My aunt had lived there alone for 30 years, and I'd only visited twice as a kid. I remembered it being quiet. Too quiet. The plan was simple. Spend a weekend clearing out her things, maybe get the place ready to sell. Come spring. I arrived on a Friday afternoon with the sky already bruising purple at the edges. The weather report mentioned a storm rolling in, but up there, storms were just part of the landscape. You learned to live with them, or you didn't live there at all. By 8 that evening, the wind had picked up enough to make the whole house creak like an old ship. The shutters rattled against their frames, and I could hear branches scraping across the roof. I'd been sorting through boxes in the living room, mostly old photographs and papers that smelled like dust and time. The power had been flickering on and off for the past hour, so I'd set out some candles just in case. Around 9:30, the lights died completely, and the darkness that settled over that house was the kind you don't really understand until you've been alone in the mountains. Not just an absence of light, a presence of something else. I lit the candles and kept working. The wind howled through the gaps in the windows, making sounds that were almost words if you listened too close. I tried not to. My aunt's handwriting covered dozens of notebooks, rambling entries about her garden, the weather, birds she'd seen. Normal things. But every now and then there'd be a line that stopped me cold. Heard the knocking again last night. Or, it stood at the tree line for an hour before dawn. She never explained what she meant, never followed up. Just moved on to talking about tomatoes or the price of firewood. I was reading one of these entries when the first knock came. 3 times, deliberate, evenly spaced. Knock, knock, knock. I looked up from the notebook, my heart already beating faster, though I couldn't say why. It was just a knock, someone at the door. Except nobody should have been out in this weather, and nobody should have known I was here. I hadn't told anyone I was coming up this weekend. The wind had been loud, but now it seemed to pause, as if the whole mountain was holding its breath. I stood and walked to the front door, the candlelight throwing my shadow huge and distorted against the walls. Through the small window beside the door, I could see nothing but rain and darkness. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Rain immediately blew inside, soaking the welcome mat and speckling my face. The porch was empty. Not just empty of people, empty of everything. No leaves blown up against the railing, no debris from the storm. Just wet wood gleaming in the faint candlelight behind me, and beyond that, the solid wall of darkness and rain. I stepped out onto the porch, letting the cold soak through my shirt, and looked around. The woods pressed in close on three sides, but I couldn't make out individual trees, just shapes, just the suggestion of things standing very still. "Hello?" My voice sounded thin and foolish. Nothing answered but the wind. I went back inside and locked the door, telling myself it was a branch. Something blown against the house by the storm. Except it hadn't sounded like a branch. It had sounded exactly like knuckles on wood, measured and intentional. I tried to shake it off, went back to the notebooks. My hands were shaking slightly as I turned the pages. 1 minute later, the knocking came again. 3 times. Same rhythm, same force. Knock, knock, knock. I was on my feet before I'd consciously decided to move. This time I didn't hesitate. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and threw open the front door, sweeping the beam across the porch into the yard along the tree line. Rain fell through the light in silver streaks. I stepped out fully, water immediately soaking into my shoes, and walked the length of the porch, checking behind the old bench, behind the firewood stack, anywhere someone could hide. Nothing. I shined the light down at the porch boards, looking for wet footprints, looking for any sign that someone had been standing there. The wood was uniformly wet from the rain, no disturbances, no tracks. I moved to the railing and pointed the flashlight out into the yard, sweeping it back and forth. The beam couldn't penetrate far into the storm, but in the brief moments I could see clearly, there was nothing. No car, no person, no animal. My aunt's words came back to me. Heard the knocking again last night. I went back inside, locked the door, and this time I pushed one of the kitchen chairs up against it. Not that a chair would stop anyone who really wanted in, but it made me feel slightly less exposed. I checked every window in the house, making sure they were all locked, and pulled the curtains closed. The candles had burned down while I was outside, and I lit fresh ones, placing them around the room so I wouldn't be caught in darkness if they went out. I tried to focus on the task I'd come here to do. Went back to sorting through my aunt's things. But I kept glancing at the door, kept listening past the sound of the wind. My phone was useless up here, no signal, so I couldn't even distract myself with messages or music. Just me and the storm and whatever had knocked on that door. Time moved strangely after that. Could have been 20 minutes or an hour when the third knock came. But this time, it wasn't from the door. It came from the wall beside me. The interior wall that separated the living room from my aunt's bedroom. 3 knocks, same rhythm, same force. But this time so close I felt the vibration through the floorboards. As if someone was standing on the other side of that wall, inches away, their knuckles pressed against the wood. I jerked away from it, nearly knocking over a candle. My breath came fast and shallow. The logical part of my brain tried to explain it. Old house, settling, wind pressure causing something to shift. But that part of my brain was getting quieter, drowned out by something older and more animal that knew the difference between house sounds and intention. The knocking didn't come again, but I couldn't move, couldn't take my eyes off that section of wall. In the candlelight, the shadows seemed to shift and breathe. I thought about my aunt living here alone for 30 years, thought about those entries in her notebook. Had she heard this? Had she stood exactly where I was standing, trying to convince herself it was nothing? I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough for my legs to start aching. Long enough for the candles to burn down another inch. The storm outside seemed to be lessening, the wind not quite so violent, and I realized I was holding my breath, straining to hear anything from the other side of that wall. Nothing. Finally, I forced myself to move. I grabbed the flashlight and walked to my aunt's bedroom door. My hand hesitated on the knob. Behind me, the living room felt too open, too exposed. But ahead of me, in that dark room, something could be waiting. I turned the knob and pushed the door open, shining the flashlight inside. The room was exactly as I'd left it that afternoon. Bed neatly made, dresser covered in dust. The window latched tight. I swept the light into the corners, under the bed, inside the closet. Nothing. Of course nothing. What had I expected to find? I left the door open this time and returned to the living room. The chair was still propped against the front door. The windows were still locked. Everything was as it should be, except for the feeling crawling up my spine that said otherwise. I couldn't stay here. That was becoming clear. Storm or no storm, dead aunt's wishes or not, I needed to leave this house. But as I started gathering my things, I realized I was too tired. The adrenaline that had been keeping me sharp was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. My car was out there in the mud, and the road down the mountain would be treacherous in this weather. If I left now, I'd probably end up in a ditch. I'd be safer here. Probably. I decided to wait it out until morning. Just a few more hours. I could manage that. I pushed the couch up against the front door for good measure, then grabbed a blanket and settled into my aunt's recliner where I could see both the door and the bedroom. I left the candles burning. I'd buy more if I had to, but I wasn't sitting in darkness. Not tonight. The wind had died down to a whisper now, and the rain had stopped entirely. In the new silence, every small sound was magnified. The house creaking, something dripping in the kitchen, my own breathing. I tried to keep my eyes open, tried to stay alert, but exhaustion pulled at me like hands in deep water. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, the lights were on. The power had come back. The sudden brightness made me squint, disoriented. The candles had burned out. Gray dawn light was starting to seep through the gaps in the curtains. I'd made it through the night. I stood up, my back aching from the recliner, and stretched. The house looked normal in the morning light, almost cheerful. I felt embarrassed about my panic, about barricading the door. Storm sounds and old houses, that's all it had been. I started moving the couch back to its place, ready to laugh at myself. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Muddy footprints on the hardwood floor. They started at the front door, clear as anything, tracked through the living room, and led straight to my aunt's bedroom. I followed them with my eyes, my stomach dropping. They passed right by where I'd been sleeping in the recliner, continued into the bedroom, and stopped beside the bed. The bed where I'd been planning to sleep last night before I changed my mind. I stood frozen, staring at those prints. They were bare feet, adult-sized. The mud was still slightly damp, which meant they'd been made recently. While I was sleeping, while I was 10 feet away in that chair, I looked at the front door. The couch had been pushed against it, the chair before that. But the prints were on this side of the door, which meant whatever made them had been inside. Had been inside while I was barricading the door against nothing. I backed toward the door, my eyes on the bedroom. The prints stopped beside the bed, but there were no prints leading away. Just those bare feet standing there, as if someone had stood watching the empty bed, perhaps wondering where I was, perhaps looking for me. I grabbed my keys and my bag, didn't bother with anything else. moved the couch aside with strength I didn't know I had, and unlocked the door. The morning air was cold and clean, and I ran for my car without looking back at the house. The drive down the mountain was a blur. I don't remember much of it, except the overwhelming need to put distance between myself and that place. It wasn't until I hit the main highway, until I saw other cars and houses and people, that my hands stopped shaking enough to grip the wheel properly. I never went back. Put the house up for sale as is, and some couple from Florida bought it without ever seeing it in person. I wonder sometimes if they hear the knocking. Wonder if they've found muddy footprints on their floor after storms. Wonder if they've read my aunt's notebooks. But mostly, I try not to think about it at all. Try not to think about what stood beside that bed while I slept, what knocked on the door, then the wall, teaching me that doors and walls don't matter. What left those prints like a message, like a promise. Sometimes, late at night in my apartment in town, I hear 3 knocks, always 3, always the same rhythm. And I know better now than to answer. I know that some things don't need a door to be opened. Some things are just waiting for you to acknowledge them. And once you do, once you let yourself believe, they know exactly where you sleep. I was driving through Haywood County on a night when the sky had opened up like something had been torn loose from heaven itself. The kind of rain that doesn't just fall, it attacks. Sheets of it hammering down so hard you can barely see past your hood, and the wipers are just slapping back and forth, doing nothing but smearing the world into watercolor streaks. I'd been visiting my uncle up near Maggie Valley, helping him clear out some of his late wife's things from the cabin. Hard work, harder memories. By the time I left, it was already getting dark, and I should have stayed the night like he asked, but I had work the next morning down in Asheville, and I'd already missed too many days. So I headed out, figuring I'd take the back roads to avoid traffic, maybe shave off 20 minutes or so. That was my first mistake. The roads up there twist and turn like they're trying to shake you off the mountain. No streetlights, just your headlights carving a small tunnel through the darkness and the rain. Every so often you'd pass a house set way back in the trees, windows glowing warm and yellow, making you feel even more alone out there in the wet and the dark. I had the radio on low, some late-night AM station playing old gospel music that kept fading in and out with static, and I was just focused on keeping the car steady on the slick asphalt. I was maybe 10 miles from the nearest town when I saw the gas station. It wasn't much. One of those old independent places that looks like it's been there since the 50s and hasn't changed much since. Single pump out front, flickering fluorescent light under a rusted awning, small building with bars on the windows. The kind of place that's probably been robbed more than once. I wasn't planning to stop. I had 3/4 of a tank, but as I got closer, my headlights caught something that made me ease off the gas. There was a man walking on the road. Not unusual by itself. People walk roads at night for all kinds of reasons, especially out here where cars break down and cell service is spotty at best. But something about the way he was moving made me slow down even more, squinting through the rain-streaked windshield to get a better look. He was walking backward, not stumbling or staggering, not looking over his shoulder or feeling his way along, just walking backward down the center of the road, smooth and steady, like it was the most natural thing in the world. His arms hung loose at his sides, and his pace was even, measured. He was maybe 50 yards ahead of me, caught in the edges of my headlights, and the rain was coming down so hard it looked like he was walking through a curtain of silver needles. I thought maybe he was drunk. We get a lot of that up in the mountains, folks who've had too much to drink at some roadhouse and end up wandering the roads at night. But his gait was too controlled, too deliberate. Drunk people stumble. They weave. This man moved with purpose, like he knew exactly where he was going, even though he couldn't see it. I slowed to a crawl, trying to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to just go around him and keep driving, but another part, The part that still believed people help each other out here in the mountains told me to at least check if he was okay. Maybe he'd had an accident. Maybe he was in shock or hypothermic from the cold rain. I pulled up alongside him, rolling down my passenger window just far enough to call out without getting too much rain in the car. The wind immediately tried to rip the words out of my mouth. "Hey, you all right?" The rain was so loud I wasn't sure if he could even hear me. I waited, watching him through the passenger window. He didn't react at all, just kept walking backward with that same steady pace, his face pointed up at the dark sky, rain streaming down his features. From what I could see in the glow of my dashboard lights, he was maybe in his 40s or 50s, wearing dark clothes that were plastered to his body. His hair was matted down against his skull. "Sir, do you need help?" Still nothing. He just kept moving, like I wasn't even there. Like my car wasn't rumbling along beside him with the window down and me shouting into the storm. I should have driven away then. Every instinct I had that wasn't drowned out by some misplaced sense of obligation was telling me to roll up that window and get the hell out of there. But I didn't listen. I never do when I should. "Hey, can you hear me?" And that's when he stopped. Just like that. Mid-step. One moment he was walking backward with that eerie smoothness, and the next he was completely still, standing in the middle of the road like a statue. The rain kept hammering down around him, bouncing off his shoulders and head, but he didn't move, didn't sway, didn't even seem to breathe. The wind suddenly picked up, howling through the trees on either side of the road, and the rain went from heavy to absolutely torrential. I could barely see him anymore through the downpour, just a dark shape maybe 15 feet away, outlined by the glow of my headlights fighting through the storm. I sat there with my foot on the brake, engine idling, wipers going full speed, and watched that shape. Something in my chest had gone tight and cold. The gospel music on the radio dissolved into pure static, a harsh white noise that seemed to match the rain. Then, slowly, his head started to turn. Not his body, just his head. It rotated on his neck like it was mounted on a swivel, smooth and mechanical, until he was looking straight at me. Even through the rain, even through the distance and the darkness, I could feel his eyes lock onto mine. They caught the reflection of my headlights, 2 small pinpricks of light in the shadow of his face, and I swear to God they didn't blink, didn't move, just stared. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Could have been 3 seconds, could have been 3 minutes. Time went strange, the way it does when your brain is trying to process something it doesn't understand. The rain was so loud it felt like being inside a drum, and my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then I blinked. Just once. Just that involuntary flutter of eyelids that you can't control. And when my eyes opened, he was closer. A lot closer. He was standing right outside my passenger window, still facing backward. Still looking at me over his shoulder with his head twisted around. I hadn't heard him move, hadn't seen him take a single step. But now he was close enough that I could see the details of his face. Pale skin, thin lips stretched too tight, eyes that were too wide and too dark. Water ran down his face in steady streams, but his expression never changed, never softened. I screamed. Actually screamed like a scared kid, even though I'm a grown man of 36 who's lived in these mountains his whole life. My hand fumbled for the window button, fingers slipping on the plastic, and the glass finally started sliding up. But as it did, he leaned forward. No, not leaned, because his body didn't move. His head just extended closer to the narrowing gap, like he was attached to a telescoping neck. The window sealed shut with a soft thunk, and I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires spun on the wet pavement, caught, and the car lurched forward. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white, and I didn't look back. Didn't dare. Just focused on the road ahead, on getting away from that gas station and that stretch of highway and that man with his backward walk and his twisted neck. But after about a mile, when my breathing had started to slow and my hands had stopped shaking quite so badly, I made another mistake. I looked in the rearview mirror. At first, I didn't see anything, just the road behind me, slick and black and empty in the red glow of my taillights. The rain was still coming down hard, and the darkness beyond my lights was absolute. Then I saw him, a silhouette on the road, maybe 100 yards back, walking backward, still walking backward. Moving along the yellow center line with that same steady mechanical pace. I pressed the gas pedal down harder. The speedometer climbed, 40, 50, 55. The car shuddered as I pushed it faster than was safe on these wet mountain roads, but I didn't care. I just needed to put distance between us. A minute passed, then 2. I was doing 60 now, taking curves too fast, feeling the tires slip and catch and slip again. My headlights swept across trees and guardrails and the occasional reflective mile marker. The gospel station had come back, but it was playing something I didn't recognize, slow and mournful, and the singer's voice sounded wrong somehow, too deep, too hollow. I looked in the mirror again. He was still there, still the same distance back, still walking backward along the yellow line, still keeping pace. No, I said out loud to myself, to God, to whoever might be listening. No, no, no. I pushed the car even faster, 65, 70. The engine was whining now, complaining about the speed and the strain. The rain hammered the windshield like it was trying to break through. But I didn't slow down, couldn't slow down. Every time I checked the mirror, and I couldn't stop checking the mirror, he was there. Always the same distance back, always walking. How the hell was he keeping up? I was doing 70 miles an hour on a winding mountain road, and somehow this man walking backward through the rain was matching my speed. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. I started talking to myself, that panicked stream of consciousness babble that comes when your brain is trying to rationalize something it knows is wrong. Maybe it was a different person. Maybe there were multiple people walking backward along the road, some kind of weird religious procession or protest. Maybe the rain was playing tricks on my eyes, making me see things that weren't there. But I knew, deep down in that animal part of your brain that still remembers what it's like to be prey, I knew I was being followed. The road finally straightened out as I got closer to the outskirts of town. Streetlights started appearing, first one every mile or so, then more frequent, casting pools of orange light across the wet pavement. I was doing 75 now, blowing past the occasional house or business, and I kept waiting for blue lights to appear behind me, for some cop to pull me over for reckless driving. But there were no blue lights, no cops. Just me and the rain and the silhouette in my mirror. I roared into town doing 60, barely slowing for the reduced speed limit signs. The main street was empty. It was past midnight on a weeknight, and the few traffic lights I passed were all green, like the universe was telling me not to stop, keep going, don't look back. But I did look back. I couldn't help it. He was still there, walking backward through the center of town, past the closed storefronts and the dark windows and the empty parking lots. Still matching my speed, still watching. I didn't stop driving until I reached my apartment complex on the south side of Asheville. I pulled into my spot and just sat there with the engine running, hands still locked on the steering wheel, staring at the rearview mirror. The parking lot was bright with security lights. A few other cars sat in their spots, rain streaming down their windows. Everything looked normal, safe. The mirror showed only empty pavement behind me. I waited 5 minutes, then 10, watching, barely breathing. But nothing appeared. No figure walking backward through the rain, no twisted face staring from the darkness. Finally, I turned off the engine and ran for my apartment door, fumbling with my keys, getting soaked in the 3 seconds it took to cross from car to building. Inside, I locked the door, threw the deadbolt, hooked the chain. Then I went to every window and checked that they were locked too. That was 3 weeks ago. I haven't driven that road since. Haven't been back to Haywood County. I called my uncle and told him I couldn't help with the cabin anymore, made up some excuse about work getting busy. He understood. He didn't push. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night. Last week, I was coming home from the grocery store in the middle of the day. Bright sunshine, clear skies, plenty of people around. I was stopped at a red light, waiting to turn onto my street, when I glanced in the rearview mirror out of habit. There was a man 3 cars back, just standing on the sidewalk. Not walking, just standing. But he was facing away from me, looking in the opposite direction of traffic. And when I looked harder, I realized his head was turned backward, looking right at me over his shoulder. The light turned green. Someone behind me honked. I drove forward in a daze, and when I checked the mirror again a few seconds later, the sidewalk was empty. I tell myself it was someone different, that it couldn't have been him, that it was just my imagination. PTSD from a weird experience on a rainy night. But I've started noticing something else now. Sometimes when I'm out walking, or sitting in a cafe, or just going about my day, I'll see someone in my peripheral vision facing the wrong way, turned around, looking back at me with their head twisted around like an owl. And when I turn to look directly at them, they're gone, or they're facing the right direction, or there was never anyone there at all. I don't know what I saw that night on the mountain road. I don't know what it wanted, or why it followed me, or why it stopped. But I know one thing for certain. It knows where I live now. And some nights, when the rain comes down hard and I'm lying awake in bed, I swear I can hear footsteps outside my window. Steady, even, moving backward through the darkness, getting closer. I was 17 the summer the shadow came. That's old enough to know better than to go chasing things in the dark, but young enough to still feel like nothing could really hurt you. I lived with my grandparents in a hollow about 40 minutes outside Hazard, Kentucky, in a house my great-grandfather built back in the 30s. It sat at the end of a gravel road that wound through hickory and oak, so thick you couldn't see your neighbor's lights, even though they were only a quarter mile off. The kind of place where quiet wasn't peaceful, it was oppressive, pressing down on you like a hand over your mouth. August that year was brutal, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer and turns your shirt to wet paper within minutes of stepping outside. But that particular evening, clouds started rolling in around supper time, dark and low-bellied. The kind that meant business. My grandmother stood at the kitchen window, drying dishes and watching the sky with the same expression she got when she talked about her sister who died young. She didn't like storms, said they stirred things up, brought things down from the ridges that were better left alone. I never paid much attention to her superstitions back then. The storm hit around 9 o'clock, not gradually, the way summer storms usually build. It just arrived, like someone flipping a switch. The wind came first, bending the trees nearly horizontal, tearing leaves and small branches free. Then the rain, so heavy and loud, it sounded like someone dumping gravel on the tin roof. Thunder rolled through the hollow in waves, shaking the floorboards under my feet. Lightning turned the world outside into a series of stark, frozen photographs. White trees against black sky, the shed listing to one side, the old well cover my grandfather kept meaning to replace. It lasted maybe 45 minutes, then stopped just as suddenly as it started. The silence afterward was absolute. No crickets, no tree frogs, not even the usual drip of water off the eaves. Just nothing. I remember standing in the living room, listening to that silence and feeling something cold move through my chest. My grandmother had gone to bed before the storm even started, and my grandfather was asleep in his chair, mouth open, the television playing to no one. I was alone with that quiet. I went to the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The air should have been cooler after a storm like that, but it wasn't. It was cold. Late summer in Kentucky, and I could see my breath. The moisture on the porch boards had started to frost over in thin, delicate patterns. I stood there in my t-shirt and jeans, arms wrapped around myself, trying to make sense of it. That's when I noticed the shadow. It was stretched across the gravel driveway, long and thin, reaching from somewhere behind me toward the road. At first I thought it was mine. The porch light was on behind me after all. But something about it was wrong. The proportions weren't quite right. Too tall, too narrow through the shoulders. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, and the shadow didn't move. It just lay there on the wet gravel, dark and still. Then lightning flickered in the distance, over the ridge, and the shadow moved. Not with me, before me. It stretched longer, spreading across the driveway like spilled oil, reaching toward the trees at the edge of the yard. The movement was smooth, almost liquid, nothing like the jerky way shadows change when light shifts. It looked intentional, purposeful. I took a step backward, toward the door, and the shadow slid forward. My heart kicked against my ribs. I told myself it was just the storm, just the weird light playing tricks, just the cold air doing something strange to my eyes. But I couldn't make myself believe it. The shadow was getting closer, pulling itself across the ground like something hauling itself up from deep water. It didn't have the jagged edges shadows usually have. It was smooth, almost soft-looking, the way smoke looks when it presses against glass. I stumbled backward through the door and slammed it shut, throwing the deadbolt. My hands were shaking so bad it took 3 tries. Through the window beside the door, I could see the shadow pause at the bottom of the porch steps. It didn't climb them. It just pooled there, spreading out like it was testing the boundary, seeing how far it could reach. I backed away from the door, into the living room. My grandfather was still asleep, snoring softly. The TV was showing an infomercial for some kind of kitchen knife. Everything was normal, domestic, safe. But when I looked back at the window, the shadow was pressed against the glass. It was flat, two-dimensional, but it moved like something alive. It spread across the window, edge to edge, blocking out the porch light. I could see the texture of it, not quite black, more like the absence of light, like looking into deep water at night. It pulsed slightly, contracting and expanding, as if it were breathing. I checked every window in the front of the house. The shadow was at all of them, pressed against the glass, looking in. Not looking, that's not the right word. It didn't have eyes. But I could feel its attention, the way you can feel someone staring at the back of your neck. It wanted something. It wanted in. I woke my grandfather by shaking his shoulder. He came to slowly, confused and irritated, asking what the hell I was on about. I tried to explain, tripping over my words, but when I pulled him to the window, the shadow was gone. Just the porch light, shining on wet boards and dripping eaves. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind, told me to quit messing around and go to bed, then shuffled off down the hallway. But I couldn't sleep. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, watching the windows, waiting for it to come back. Around 3 a.m, I heard something. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of sound, a dead spot in the air. I looked at the back door, and there it was, pressed against the small window at the top, spreading like ink in water. This went on for 3 nights. The shadow would appear after dark, always after a period of absolute silence, and press itself against the windows. It never tried to break in, never made a sound, but I could feel it testing the house, looking for a way through. I stopped sleeping. My grandmother noticed the dark circles under my eyes, the way I jumped at every small noise. But when I tried to tell her, she just pressed her lips into a thin line and told me not to speak of it. Wouldn't tell me I was crazy, wouldn't tell me to stop making things up, just told me not to speak of it. That's when I knew she'd seen it too, or something like it. On the fourth night, I made a mistake. I'd been watching the shadow for hours, watching it slide from window to window, and I'd started to feel something besides fear. Anger, maybe, or frustration. This was my house, my home, and something was trying to get in. So when it pressed itself against the kitchen window, I walked right up to the glass and stared back at it. It stopped moving. We stayed like that for what felt like a long time, me on one side of the glass, it on the other. I couldn't see through it. It was too dark, too complete. But I had the overwhelming sense that it was seeing me. Really seeing me. Not just noticing me, but understanding something about me, something I didn't even understand about myself. Then it started to change. The edges of it began to roughen, to take shape. I saw what might have been shoulders, a head, the suggestion of arms. It was forming itself into something human-shaped, something that looked like me. The proportions were right now, my height, my build. It even had the same slump to its shoulders that I got when I was tired. I stepped back from the window, and it stepped forward, matching me. When I raised my hand, it raised its hand, but a second earlier, as if it knew what I was going to do before I did it. My reflection, leading instead of following. That's when I ran. I don't remember making the decision. One moment I was standing there, watching myself in shadow form, and the next I was tearing through the house, grabbing my grandfather's truck keys from the bowl by the door. I didn't wake them, didn't explain, just ran. The shadow peeled itself off the window and flowed across the yard after me, faster now, keeping pace as I sprinted for the truck. I got the engine started just as it reached the driver's side door. It pressed itself against the window, and I could see my own face in it now, rendered in darkness, mouth open in a silent scream. I threw the truck in reverse and gunned it, spraying gravel, fishtailing onto the road. In the rearview mirror, I could see it standing in the driveway, tall and impossibly thin, watching me go. I drove to a friend's house 10 miles away and slept on his couch. Didn't explain why. Didn't go home for 2 days. When I finally did, my grandmother was sitting on the porch, shelling peas. She didn't ask where I'd been, just told me another storm was coming, that I could hear it in the way the birds were acting. Said maybe after this one, things would settle down again. The storm came that night, bigger than the first one, meaner. It knocked out power for half the hollow and tore part of the roof off the church down the road. I sat in the dark with my grandparents, listening to the thunder, and I swear I could feel the shadow out there, somewhere in the storm, dissolving back into the rain like it had never been solid at all. When the power came back on and I checked the windows, it was gone. That was 15 years ago. I don't live in that hollow anymore. I left for college and never moved back. My grandparents are gone now. The house sold to someone from out of state who wanted a weekend place. I think about the shadow sometimes, especially on nights when storms roll through. I wonder if it was something that came down from the ridge, like my grandmother used to warn about. Or if it was something that lived in the rain itself, something that needed the quiet between storms to take shape. But mostly I wonder if it's still there, waiting in that hollow for the next storm to pass, waiting for the air to go still and cold, waiting for someone to step outside and see their shadow move wrong, to watch it slide across wet gravel toward them, learning their shape, their movements, their self. I wonder if it's still looking for a way in, because sometimes, on nights when the rain stops suddenly and the world goes quiet, I catch sight of my shadow out of the corner of my eye. And just for a second, just for a heartbeat, it seems to move a fraction before I do, like it remembers, like it's still trying to lead instead of follow. I never look directly at it anymore. I learned that much, at least. Some things don't need your attention to exist, but giving it to them makes them real in ways they weren't before. So I keep my eyes forward. I stay out of the quiet after storms, and I try not to think about what might be pressed against my windows when I'm not looking. But on nights like tonight, when thunder rumbles in the distance and the rain starts to ease, I can feel it out there. Patient. Waiting. Following me the way shadows do, one storm at a time, one quiet night closer to finding its way in.